Hello and welcome to today's edition of China Now. My name is Makiza Micheline Latifa, and as always, we'll begin today's edition of the show with China Current, where Kris will be bringing us updates on all that there is to be known about China, especially post-COVID, and how the country is navigating the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic posed.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Hi, welcome to China Current. I'm Kris. This past Labor Day holiday in China, spanning from 29th April to 3rd May, is the first national holiday unaffected by COVID restrictions. The 5-day holiday is often referred to as the Golden Week in China. Every year, many people would get out of the houses, turn their work phones off, go on a trip with the family and enjoy the spring. But that hasn't really happened for 3 years, as vacation demand was severely suppressed by pandemic control measures, even though traveling wasn't entirely impossible. And during this year's Golden Week, tourism rebounded strongly, even exceeded pre-COVID levels. A total of 274 million domestic trips were made, a 70% increase from last year and 19% higher than 2019. This Labor Day is also the first long holiday since China resumed outbound group tours since February. Data shows that by early April, mainland outbound travel bookings for this holiday had multiplied by 18 times year-on-year. Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines are the most popular destinations for Chinese tourists. Among all the touristy places, a small industrial city of 4 million people, well, small by Chinese standard, Zibo, rose from obscurity to fame and became one of China's hottest destinations for domestic tourists. Zibo is just a regular place. There's no fancy attractions, no royal palace or terracotta warriors. Last time was famous nationwide was 2,000 years ago as the capital of one of the 7 warring states. This previously overlooked city has experienced a staggering 20-fold rise in tourism bookings during the holiday season. The secret is simple: outdoor barbecue. Zibo Barbecue offers a distinctive dining experience. Millions of people flock to Zibo, gather together in barbecue zones built by the local government that usually feature live band performance and can accommodate up to 10,000 people. You sit around tables with little stoves, grill your own skewers, wrap your meat with scallions in a thin pancake. It's superb, not only in terms of taste, but that overall experience of celebrating food, friendship, and life. There's a heartwarming story behind this overnight sensation of Zibo barbecue. During the COVID pandemic outbreak in 2022, many cities in China went through lockdowns. Thousands of college students from the surrounding lockdown cities were guided to Zibo for quarantine. The city took these young students, giving them not only a space for quarantine, but also care and love. When the lockdown was over, Zibo offered every student a free barbecue meal. Now that the pandemic is over and everyone is free to travel again, thousands of students from all across China decided to thank the city in person by bringing their friends and families to Zibo and repaying the city with their consumption. The story quickly went viral on Chinese social media, and now this little town became the most popular city in China. Another event that comes back to post-COVID China is the Auto Show. Auto Shanghai, or the Shanghai International Automobile Industry Exhibition, is a biannual international automobile show that alternates with the Beijing Auto Show as China's yearly international automotive exhibition. There were more than 1,400 vehicles on display this year, with 513 of them being new energy cars, including all kinds of fancy concept cars. BMW even had a booth to give out free ice creams to visitors. Everyone likes ice cream. Never had any luxury car attract as much attention as free ice cream. And that's true. A video showed that the workers running the ice cream booth were telling ethnic Chinese visitors that free ice cream had run out. But the next minute, they took out the frozen goodie and handed it to a white man with wide smile on their faces. The video went viral and BMW got slammed for giving preferential treatment to Westerners by outraged Chinese social media users. The hashtag BMW Mini accused of discrimination attracted 200 million views on social media platform Weibo. BMW later issued an apology, saying that the group of non-Chinese people seen hanging around the booth savoring ice cream were actually BMW staff members. The internet still didn't buy it, because the German brand was still talking in an arrogant manner. This incident is not the first time the global brands have suffered public relations backlashes in the market. Mercedes-Benz had to apologize in 2018 to Chinese consumers for an Instagram post that featured a quote from the Dalai Lama. Tesla was also criticized during the 2021 Shanghai Auto Show as a consumer protest occurred on a Tesla stand for its poor quality control of vehicles. Chinese consumers are now making a stand that if you want to earn our money, at least treat us and our culture with some respect. China is the largest electric vehicle market in the entire world, and now China Passenger Car Association is proposing to the government to cancel special licenses for electric vehicles in the next 2 years because they are simply not special anymore. China began to award special green license plates to new energy vehicles since 2016 with many subsidies in order to boost electric vehicle sales. For example, consumers in Shanghai who trade in their old gasoline-powered cars for new pure electric cars can receive 10,000 yuan in subsidies for each new vehicle. Now as EVs account for 1 in 4 cars sold in China and uphold 87% year-on-year growth in 2022, China will take gradual steps to withdraw subsidies for EVs, including their special green license plates. And Russia and India suspended negotiations over using rupees for trade between the two countries after a year of talk for the settlement mechanism. This decision has disappointed many Indian importers of Russian oil and coal who were looking forward to lower currency conversion costs. It was estimated that Russia would have an annual rupee surplus of over $40 billion if such a permanent rupee payment worked out. According to a report, the Russian government believes that accumulating rupee is not desirable at this stage since rupee is not a fully convertible currency in international trade. For Moscow, Chinese yuan seems more favorable for trade settlement as China occupies a rather considerable share of global export of goods, but also because Russia has increasingly turned to Chinese yuan from the US dollar after experiencing Western sanction for its military operation in Ukraine. Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang was visiting Germany during the past few days. He held talks with German Foreign Minister, had some diplomatic exchange, but interestingly, in his tight schedule, he made a special stop at the city of Potsdam, southwest of Berlin. The city was the site of the Potsdam Conference in 1945 when the leaders of the Allied nations met in a defining moment for the post-war balance of power. This was the moment of a special significance for the Chinese people because the Potsdam Declaration reaffirmed that China's territory, including Taiwan, stolen by Japan, would be returned to China. The foreign minister's visit to Potsdam also sends a message to the world about China's stance in maintaining the post-war order. He left a message in an autograph book, safeguarding the post-war international order, promoting world peace and prosperity, and achieving China's national reunification. Born to Fly, a Chinese military film focusing on the Air Force test pilots, was previously hyped as Chinese version of Top Gun. However, it has excited criticism on the Chinese internet for its inaccurate depiction of both the Air Force crew members and Chinese jet fighters. The film is accused by netizens of portraying the main character being a cocky savior who often disobeys orders. The audience didn't like this classic Hollywood style of the main character, because these kind of manners are absolutely forbidden in any modern military. And besides, although the film intends to emphasize the technological advancement of PLAAF, Chinese military enthusiasts are outraged about all the goofs in the movie scenes, especially the scene where an air-to-air missile wasn't even technically attached to one of the most advanced Chinese jet fighters, J-16. Many military fans joke that this scene should never ever be allowed to play overseas, because once other countries see this, no one would ever want to import Chinese jet fighters again. When you ask who is China's richest and most powerful woman, many people may come to the answer Dong Mingzhu. She's the president of Gree Electric, one of the world's largest air conditioner manufacturer. Because of her toughness in the business world, she's often called by the internet as the Iron Lady. Dong is also an outspoken person and has appeared on several Chinese TV shows, including one reality TV show in 2021, We Who Are New to the Workplace. The show invited several outstanding young college graduates to film them as they started their first job internship after graduation. Dong came to the show as one of the bosses, and she hired her own intern, Meng Yutong. The Iron Lady loved her new intern and even promoted Meng to be her full-time secretary after the show. She even said publicly that she wanted to nurture her young secretary to be the second Dong Mingzhu. Her promotion drew huge controversy back then on the internet. To have the CEO taking you under her wings as your first ever job? For most people at the time, Meng sure entered the fast track of climbing the corporate ladder. But after 2 years, the young professional quit the job last week. According to Meng's social media post, it was because her working hours were simply too intense. She didn't have any weekends for 2 months straight and even worked 21 hours straight in one day. The news again hit big on the social media, but this time everyone is on her side. Everyone resonates with her about the pain of working extra hours, about how the bosses would always paint you a beautiful big picture just to tell you to work harder now. Meng said that she's planning to apply for graduate schools. Maybe she's not born to be the second Iron Lady, but herself after all. Now, that's what's been happening in China for the past week. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts and comments on our show, please contact us at the email address below. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Kris, for bringing us all the updates we need to know about what's happening in China. It's now time for Threshold, the segment of the show that talks about advanced technological innovations in China. So today, Lisa will be telling us or giving us insights into the aerial seeding technology.
Hi, I'm Lisa, and this is Threshold in China, a segment that gives you a taste of the future before it actually happens. Today, I'm going to talk about emerging technologies that have life-changing potential and assess their ability to influence our life in the near future. In 2022, more than 900,000 people worldwide are fighting to survive famine-like conditions. And it is 10 times more than that of 5 years ago. The world is facing a serious food crisis. Today, we are going to talk about a technology that helps to grow more food. It is called aerial seeding. So basically, it is spreading seeds using an aircraft. It is a technology that is becoming increasingly popular across the world, especially when the field is large. It can ensure that the seeds are evenly distributed by programming UAVs, that it spreads the seeds in a precise pattern. But one of the problems with this method to sow is that when the seed dropped from the aircraft, they are often left on the ground unburied. Birds and other animals come and eat them up. They are also blown away easily by the wind, so the crops don't grow. Well, scientists from Zhejiang University and Carnegie Mellon University have developed something to help. They've created a new technology that enabled seeds to drill into the ground automatically, making aerial seeding much more effective and efficient. They've actually found inspiration in a type of plant called erodium. Its fruits tend to be shaped like long bird beak, and each fruit has 5 carpels, each containing a spiral seed up to 6 centimeters long, a swollen arrow-like americab at one end containing the embryo, and a slender spiraling beak. The spiraling beak works like a spring that can catapult itself half a meter from the parent plant. Once landed on the ground, the change of moisture in the surrounding environment, such as a sudden shower of rain, would cause the beak to uncoil and coil again, generating thrust to drill itself like a corkscrew into the ground. This gave erodium a very high germination rate. With this in mind, scientists have come up with seed carriers shaped like erodium beak. They've used wood veneer to make these carriers because it's stiff enough to drill into the soil, and it also responds to moisture changes. When it gets wet, it bends and coils, allowing it to self-drill into the soil. The secret here is that the wood veneer is composed of alternating layers of softwood and hardwood. These two kinds of layers have different compositions and structures, so when they absorb water, they swirl to different degrees, and this causes the layer to slide against each other, resulting in larger bending angles than that of other materials. More thrust is generated for an elastic material such as wood veneer, so it screws nicely into the soil. The scientists tested it out in different weather conditions. During the experiment, 2 light rainfalls occurred on the first day and a 6-hour thunderstorm with heavy rain on the second day. The results show that the anchored seeds have a 61% germination rate, and the seed carriers could germinate naturally without human assistance after 5 to 7 days in an open environment. In comparison, unburied seeds only achieved a 12.5 germination rate in the same condition, similar to conventional aerial seeding. Now, making these carriers is a process involving cutting, shaping, sanding, and gluing thin sheets of wood veneer together. It seems to be a very labor-intensive work, so could this process be automated in the future for mass production? Well, the answer is yes. Scientists are already thinking about solutions such as using cutting and shaping machines, robotic arms, and even 3D printing. Let's move on to our threshold rating, that is readiness, novelty, and ripple. The readiness category refers to the maturity of a technology from lab demonstration, that is a 1, to mass production, that is a 5. The novelty scores refers to how new the innovation is. 1 means there is a small differentiation from existing technology, and 5 means the innovation fulfills a new function. Finally, ripple is our opinion of a technology's potential for life-changing impacts and how widely it can be applied elsewhere. So, how good is it according to the standard of threshold rating? The researchers have tested this technique in various conditions and designs, including single-tailed seed carriers with single-coiled and double-coiled bodies. They've even made a larger version of the carrier for the endangered white bark pine seed. Hence, the carriers could be customized and adapted to different tasks. However, the biggest hurdle, as we mentioned before, is how to automate the production process, which would eventually bring down cost and increase production. Therefore, at this stage, it is a 2 for readiness. Next is novelty. The self-drilling seed carriers has never been seen before, and this team is the first to try it. This is probably why Nature magazine featured it as their cover story, so it is a 4. Now we have to decide how much influence it's going to have. The self-drilling seed carriers can be used for the quick deployment of seeds, microorganisms, and other soil nutrients through aerial delivery. This could have some very promising impact in agriculture, reforestation, and conservation of the environment. But there are limitations. Since these seed carriers are made out of wood veneers, they may not withstand extreme weather conditions such as heavy rain or strong winds for a long period. Soil conditions can also affect the ability of seed carriers to drill, with moist and well-drained soil being preferred. Also, a large amount of wood and glue are needed to produce the seed carrier pods. The wood will need to be sourced sustainably, and manufacturers need to ensure that the type of glue used in these seed pods will not cause soil degradation by leaving behind harmful chemicals. All these conditions need to be met for commercializing and mass deployment of this aerial seeding technique. For now, it is a 3 for the ripples category, and let's look out for future developments. To sum up, the seed carriers get a 2, 4, and 3 in each category, and it's right on the brink of our threshold. In the past 5 years, China has done a lot of research into sustainable farming. They have found ways to make dry land fertile, turn salt water into drinking water, made crops that can grow in desert, and even created a new way to plant seeds from the air that is more efficient and less expensive. If all these new techniques were used together, they could turn a quarter of China's land, which is desert, into farmland. They could also use these same ideas to stop the spread of desert and make new forests to help fight climate change. Human technologies is often inspired by nature. In one of our previous episodes, we talked about how scientists made a manta ray robots to help us explore the deep sea. What other nature-mimicking innovation have you heard of? As usual, we welcome your feedback and thoughts. Bye.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's now time for the Thinkers Forum, and this week's episode of Thinkers Forum features Convener of the Socialist Movement of Ghana, Comrade Kyeretwie Opoku, who will be speaking on a very important subject matter, which is geopolitical changes in Africa.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, comrades, friends. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been asked to speak a bit about geopolitical changes on the African continent. It's a huge topic, but I'll try and break it down a bit. So, core message is that Africa, based on its history, based on current trends, and the way geopolitics, global politics is shaping up, really has two possible futures. One, there's a Pan-Africanist future that allows us to participate in global affairs as a single large continent in a multipolar framework with all the other major blocs and countries of the world. The other possibility for Africa is that we are recolonized. Our old colonial masters in Europe and their new colonial master, the United States, have every intention to resume direct control of our affairs in a way they have not had since the 60s and 70s. Why does this matter? We live in times of conflict. There's a low-key global war underway between the progressive socialist forces of the world that want to establish a new alternative for organizing society. On the other hand, we have the forces of imperialism led by the United States, which seek to destroy any possibility of an alternative. By the sheer facts of history and the logic of struggle, China ends up being the leader of the socialist and progressive world. It's willy-nilly. Whether you want the role or not, it is thrust upon you. You're the focus of the imperialist onslaught. You're the main target for the US's attempt to re-establish its hegemony over the world. It's a Cold War now, but it could very quickly become a very hot war. The nature of war allows for many accidents and unpredictable consequences. So things could change, even just as a result of the irresponsible statements. For example, in the last few weeks, a number of US generals have been making the predictions that war between the United States and China is possible within the next 24 months. That kind of statement raises tensions and creates facts on the ground, whether we like it or not. However, is that for us, for the forces that represent civilization, the forces that want humanity to continue to develop and grow, the outcome we need, the best outcome for us, is prevent conflict from heating up. In other words, to win the confrontation without the enemy firing a single shot. That's the best outcome for us, because clearly time is on our side. So we must be working to win the war by mobilizing society. That kind of deterrence requires alliances. It requires that China, Africa, Latin America, the rest of Asia, that we strengthen our alliances around things that we value, around cooperation, and make it clear to our opponents, imperialism, that they cannot prevail, they cannot frighten us into submission. I'm not saying that we don't also prepare for the alternative. We must prepare. The forces we fight against are crazy enough to do something silly. And we must learn to encircle imperialism and to establish the authority of the new world that is possible. So, needless to say that in this coming an existent confrontation, the socialist forces in Africa stand staunchly with China. We are absolutely clear that in this context, whatever other issues there are, China represents the survival of the human race and the growth of civilization. So, a large part of the reason that we are here is to communicate this and to try and turn the objective strategic alliance into a friendship, to get to know you, to allow you to know us, and to know the various forces that we represent, so that we can learn to work together better to save our planet. So Africa, why is Africa important? By 2050, the projections are that Africa will have a population of 2.5 billion people by 2050. That's less than 30 years from now. Also by 2050, Africa will have a GDP of between 16 and maybe 20 trillion US dollars, compared to China, which will have 58 trillion, and the US, which by then will only have 25 trillion on the current course of economic development. Africa also has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. Now, in the context of the kind of nutrition crisis that the world faces, it is a hugely significant fact. 60% of uncultivated arable land is in Africa. Africa also has 40% of the world's gold, 90% of all the chromium and platinum. We have the world's largest reserves of cobalt, diamonds, uranium, nickel, silver, and several other strategic and precious minerals. Africa also has, significantly in the context of the current and evolving conflict, 54 seats out of 198 in the United Nations Organization. Africa represents a quarter of the votes in the UN. Africa represents a very important bloc. I'm not suggesting that Africa has a monolithic vote, but the way Africans think about the rest of the world is important for how the world's various contexts and cooperation evolve. So, simply put, Africa's resources are critical for the development of humanity. But they are also critical for the logistics of conflicts. Either way, who Africa makes friends with, who Africa supports, who Africa is in solidarity with, is an important issue for the future of the world. Now, it is in this context that two trends are emerging around African geopolitics. This is vastly oversimplified, I know, but just to get the point across. So China is reaching out in solidarity, in friendship, in trade. It is developing infrastructure. It is financing projects. It is engaged in collaboration. It is engaged in cultural exchanges, education, etc., with Africa. Across the length and breadth of the continent, China is establishing mutually beneficial and science-based relations with Africans. And that is good. I'm not saying that China doesn't seek to get the best deal it can on specific transactions and so on. Trade is trade. We're all horse thieves when it comes down to it. But trade is very different from colonial acquisitions and domination. Now, on the other hand, imperialism's, and particularly the US and Europe's response to the fact of Africa's potential wealth is very different. That seeks to dominate and to control Africa's future. And this is partly an objective in itself to access these resources for the benefit of American capital, American transnational corporations, and so on. So this is the context in which African geopolitics is changing. I'm sure everybody's aware of our history. We suffered 400 years of a transatlantic slave trade in which our best youth, male and female, were captured, were transported across the Atlantic Ocean, and became chattel, became beasts of burden to resource the growth of the United States, but also significant colonies in the Caribbean and then Brazil and so on. So many, many cultures, many, many civilizations were destroyed as part of keeping the slave trade going. I'm sure you're also all aware that following the collapse of slavery in the United States, as a result of the resistance of slaves themselves, as a result of changes in people's sense of the morality of things, partly because of the resistance and other things, that Europe in particular needed to find a new economy to replace the slave trading economy, which is when they hit on the brilliant idea of colonization. If you can't sell the people, control their resources, all the minerals and the energy resources that I spoke about earlier. So colonialism was essentially about converting Africa into a series of resource concessions owned by competing European states. It meant that we were set back even further because the only development we saw was the development required to facilitate exports of raw materials from our continent to Europe to be processed and then in some cases sold back to us. But mostly we were not a major importer, a major market for these products. Then, after the Second World War, when Europe was simply too weak to forcibly maintain control over its African possessions, they hit on the grand strategy of slowly, grudgingly allowing what we call flag and anthem independence. So allow people to feel they've established states, allow them to have their own presidents, their own national anthems, and their own flags to wave around, even join the UN, but maintain the essential character of the colonial economy in which every decision is made to facilitate European extraction of resources from Africa. Except, of course, that now standing beside and above the Europeans was the United States, which itself had not been an African colonial power and had very much wanted to become an African colonial power. And one of the conditions for their participation in the reconstruction of Europe after the war, of course, not presented as a simple economic play, represented as the assertion of liberal values, American values, freedom for everybody, and so on. But what it essentially meant was that now America gets a larger piece of the pie and indeed ends up guaranteeing the stability of a neo-colonial regime. However, neo-colonialism as an imperial strategy has failed. It has failed across Africa. It has allowed 54 situations of resistance, of growing resistance, a chaotic situation. It has not allowed the West to optimize its extraction in a smooth way. It's a daily struggle. And I think that neocolonialism was always an experiment to see if we can manage our exploitation and repression this way. And having failed, the West has made the simple, obvious decision: end it, take over again. There are obviously huge complexities about the manner in which this reassertion of direct imperial control will happen. There are many, many different things going on. So the first is, if you like, the battle for hearts and minds, ideological warfare. The West, for reasons of its colonial history and for reasons of just sheer effort it puts into it, dominates the African media scene, especially as regards how Africa sees the rest of the world, for example, Russia, Ukraine, or US, China, are presented to Africa directly by a handful of Western or Western allied media houses. BBC, I think, remains the most influential broadcaster in Africa, but it's not the only one. All of these stations, government funded, direct, agencies, if you like, of various ministries of foreign affairs, maintain 24-hour a day with the main purpose of shaping how we think, particularly about conflict situations or coming conflict situations. And that's important because even the indigenous African stations, because we seldom have the capacity for independent news gathering, you'll find that station after station collects its international news direct from one of these other stations. In most cases, without even editing the language. You hear the same report on a Ghanaian radio station that you hear on BBC. Same word for word reproduction. And you also have, though increasingly perhaps less influential with the masses, but important for the quote-unquote intellectual classes, a huge effort to control what the print media does. So the Brentworth Foundation that funds a lot of media in Africa, in alliance often with the National Endowment for Democracy, which is actually a State Department agency. And so there's a system of research grants, there's a system of fellowships, revolving doors between media houses and these foundations. And there are even allegations of direct personal payments to journalists, which ensure that they produce a certain kind of content. And because they're better resourced, and because they're better able to produce the glossy media stuff and so on, they tend to dominate the written media. Now, the messaging they're putting out there, setting that, essentially we're being told that development means being more like the US, being more like Western Europe. But there's also increasingly a shrill and very crude kind of propaganda being waged against the countries that the West considers its enemies. Russia has been completely hysterical over the last year. We are told that there are huge skyscrapers of meat factories in which, Uyghurs are being chopped up and made into minced meats, and that meat is being exported to Africa and making us all cannibals and so on. I know it sounds crazy, and I know I've learned in the last week how difficult it is for the Chinese public to take this seriously. But again, the point I was making is that the media assault is total. It's not just about these silly stories. It also involves an ideological orientation towards the mystic, towards superstition, towards irrationality. So you'll find in the African media that the media houses that thrive are those that are providing support to some of these wildly right-wing evangelical churches. And they have money to pay huge money for advertising space. Typically in Africa, the first few hours of the day, from 4 o'clock to like 6:30, are occupied by religious sermons. You have a priest launching into all sorts of things. And this is what people start their day with. So you have to understand that in the context in which people have become so used to irrationality, stories that suggest that other parts of the world are driven by irrational behavior are not difficult to swallow. So it is true that the propaganda being waged against China, being waged against Russia, are ridiculous, but don't dismiss them just because of that. Second feature of the current assault on Africa relates to debt. Africa has, over the last 30 years, become addicted to the euro market, the bond market. Governments are able to go in there, and speculative financiers from the US, but also from Europe, will give out money for projects which, on paper, simply don't make sense. But because they know that governments will be able, over time, to find money from somewhere to effect repayments at exorbitant rates, there's just a churn. You have the financial markets, the financial industry, chasing African governments for sovereign debts. So you have all these deals that are backed by the full faith and credits of governments all over the country. And now all those governments are broke and in desperate need of bailouts. So you have countries like Ghana, which just 24 months ago was the darling of the Washington institution, the international finance institutions, is now on its knees seeking an IMF bailout for $3 billion. Just 2 years after receiving something like $6 billion in loans and grants to manage the COVID crisis. Of course, a lot of that money was simply blown. And as I was telling my new friend over here, government can't account for it. There's actually an official Auditor General's report before Parliament now, which says that of the $3 billion of a particular facility, contracted for COVID response, less than $200 million went into anything related to the health sector. Forget COVID. Anything related to health. They could only find $200 million that went into the health sector. The rest of it into all sorts of things, including building a national cathedral. So where the deepest economic crisis, cathedral, a big church. Okay. Yeah. Now all of these countries are now on their knees, Zambia for example, and are finding that in order to get IMF bailouts, they need to be in the good books of the Western powers, who typically constitutes the membership of the executive board. So they're all cozying up to the US and France and so on, because on objective terms, they can't actually afford to open up their books for scrutiny. So debt is a huge instrument. The last thing I think you will see is destabilization and militarization. So across the continent, because there are all these underlying discontents, many of which have colonial origins or have been exacerbated by colonial rule, you find that there are large areas where feudal land relations still exist. So you have peasant communities fighting or suppressed by landlords over access to land to produce, over water rights, over all sorts of other rights. You have mistreatment of women. You have marginalization of all sorts of communities based on ethnic, etc. Now, in that context, one of the things we've observed is that for all the countries where you have a majority Muslim population, in the last 15 years, there has been a funded insertion of militant Islamic forces from Central Asia. They have been introduced into the situation to destabilize a lot of corrupt. Admittedly, we're talking about corrupt governments. These are not people's governments, but it's the responsibility of their own people to deal with it, not militants from Asia, who suddenly are well-funded, well-armed, and have communication support and so on. There's a lot of evidence that points to that support having come from imperialist forces, Western Europe and the United States. Now that creates the conditions for these same players to step back into the region and present themselves as, it's a shakedown, it's a protection racket. Create the problem, then step forward as a solution. Come as a savior, not as a further complication of the problem. So you find that this is happening certainly across the entire Sahel area, all of which happen to be former French colonies as well. But you're also talking about places like Mozambique, and you find these forces concentrated around areas of high mineralization. That's where they are. They're not out there protecting communities from militant Islam. They're protecting mining operations of big European and American companies. Then, in the middle of this, you have the US in 2007 creating an Africa Command. This is not some diplomatic, support operation, making your military stronger and so on. It coordinates combat operations. At the same time, you have NATO declaring that Africa is its southern border and asserting rights to operate in Africa. So at present, for example, in West Africa, you have US, French, UK, Belgian troops operating across the region. Even so-called pacifists, Germany and Japan, have troops operating in Africa. That is the reality today. The clear statement is that if the West is not able to woo support through media operations, if it is not able to suborn support through financial debt control, it will take over. And again, this may sound far-fetched, but we know from our history that imperialism is more than willing to shed blood, to kill our people for power, and so on. Now, none of these strategies is actually successful. There's huge resistance to all of them. I make the point that Pan-African television, which my comrade here operates, has quickly become one of the most popular stations in Ghana in less than 7 years. And that has worked because people are looking for an alternative. People are looking for a different message, for a different perspective, a different way of understanding the world around them, the world they operate in. So clearly there's scope for pushing back against the current imperialist domination of our media, against the current effort to weaponize our people's thinking against us. By the same token, if you look at the level of chaos that individual countries, for example, my own country, Ghana, are experiencing around the effort to ram down a loan repayment system. Because essentially what the IMF is doing is saying, well, you're going to pay, we're going to give you a little money, which is public resources. We're going to put some public resources into ensuring that you can pay, reach a deal with your creditors, who are huge international banks, to ensure that they get value. Maybe it will take a few more years. And then we'll give you the stamp of approval to go back to them and borrow even more, get deeper into the hole. And in that process, one of the key elements is what they're calling a domestic debt exchange program. Essentially, the government is saying that, well, we borrowed all this money, including from some of you, our citizens. We can't pay. We need to prioritize paying the big boys in the West. So we're not going to pay you. So that means all the pension funds, accumulated workers' entitlements, and so on are being liquidated. And there's a huge outcry. The government has had to postpone its deadline for signing this agreement, which will enable it to sign with the IMF and go back to the markets. I think 10 times now. They've had to do this 10 times now because of the sheer level of public resistance and the sheer level of popular mobilization that's taking place. You even have now, I mean, it's probably unheard of it, but in my recollection, you even have the immediately past Chief Justice of the country in the streets demonstrating and saying that, sorry, I'm a lawyer, this is the law, you can't do this, and if I was still a sitting judge, this is the way I would have ruled. In our domestic politics, it means a lot. And then I think the third, and these are just instances, but the resistance to even the military occupation strategies is growing. In West Africa, we found the regimes that have allowed US troops in are facing stiff resistance. In the last 2 years, there have been successful coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and in the process, French troops have been evicted from Burkina, from Mali, and the two countries are talking about a possible unification. So these are just some highlights about the kinds of trends that we're seeing emerge on the African continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for watching today's edition of the show. If you have any feedback or suggestions for us in the coming episodes of the show, please do not hesitate to reach out to us through the email provided below. Thanks for watching and see you same time next week.